The small town of Glenwood was abuzz with excitement when the news of Nathaniel Whitmore's engagement broke. The Whitmores were a powerful and wealthy family, owning half the businesses in town. Nathaniel, at 28, was the heir to the Whitmore fortune, a young man of charm and good looks, admired by many. His fiancée, Sarah Lawson, was a local schoolteacher. Their love story seemed like a modern-day fairy tale, a picture-perfect union of wealth and modesty, capturing the hearts of the community. But behind the glossy facade, dark undercurrents threatened to destroy everything. Nathaniel's father, Henry Whitmore, a man known for his shrewd business acumen and an iron grip over his family, was the embodiment of power and control. At 58, Henry was still a formidable presence, his towering frame and piercing blue eyes commanding respect and fear. He had built an empire from scratch, turning the Whitmore name into a symbol of prestige and influence. But Henry's success had come at a cost. He had a need to control every aspect of his life, including his son's future. From the moment Nathaniel introduced Sarah to his father, Henry had been fixated on her. Sarah's beauty and grace captivated him, but it was more than that. For Henry, it was about possession. He was used to getting what he wanted, and Sarah represented something forbidden, something that he could not have, which made her all the more desirable. He masked his obsession behind a facade of fatherly concern, expressing doubts about Sarah's intentions and her suitability for the Whitmore legacy. Nathaniel, oblivious to his father's true feelings, dismissed Henry's objections as mere overprotectiveness. He was in love and determined to marry Sarah, convinced that his father would eventually come around. But Sarah sensed something unsettling in Henry's gaze, something that made her skin crawl. She tried to voice her concerns to Nathaniel, but he brushed them off, unable to see the darkness lurking beneath his father's composed exterior. As the wedding date approached, Henry's obsession grew. He began to find excuses to visit Sarah at her workplace, under the pretense of discussing wedding plans or offering assistance. His presence was always imposing, his comments laced with veiled compliments and unsettling undertones. Sarah, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, confided in her best friend, Emily, who urged her to confront Nathaniel. But Sarah hesitated, not wanting to come between the man she loved and his father. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the school late, she found Henry waiting for her by her car. The parking lot was deserted, the fading light casting long shadows on the pavement. He smiled, that unsettling smile she had come to dread, and offered her a ride home. She declined politely, her heart pounding in her chest, but Henry persisted. "Sarah, I insist. It's not safe for a beautiful woman like you to be out alone." His voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, but Sarah stood her ground. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm fine. Nathaniel will be here soon." It was a lie, but she hoped it would deter him. Henry's eyes narrowed for a moment, his smile faltering. Then he nodded, his demeanor shifting back to the doting father. "Of course, dear. Just looking out for you." As she drove away, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, Sarah knew she had to tell Nathaniel. This was more than just fatherly concern. It was something twisted, something dangerous. That night, she tried to talk to him, but he was distracted, preoccupied with the pressures of the wedding and his father's disapproval. "You're overreacting, Sarah. He's just worried. It'll be fine after the wedding, I promise." But it wasn't fine. The next day, Sarah received a bouquet of roses at her school with a note that sent chills down her spine. "You belong with us, Sarah. Forever. H." The message was clear, and the implications terrifying. She decided she couldn't wait any longer. She would confront Henry herself and end this once and for all. The confrontation took place at the Whitmore estate. Sarah arrived unannounced, her heart racing as she walked up the grand staircase to Henry's study. He was surprised to see her, but quickly masked it with a welcoming smile. "Sarah, what a pleasant surprise. I want you to stop," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This, whatever it is you're doing, it needs to end. I love Nathaniel, and I'm going to marry him. You need to respect that." Henry's smile never reached his eyes. He stood up, slowly, his towering presence casting a shadow over her. "Respect? Oh, Sarah, you misunderstand me. I'm only trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she demanded, from making a mistake," he replied softly. "A mistake that could cost you everything." The threat was implicit, but clear. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She realized then that Henry Whitmore was not just obsessed. He was dangerous. Sarah's confrontation with Henry left her shaken, but she was determined not to let him intimidate her. She avoided being alone and made sure to always be around people she trusted. Despite her best efforts, Henry's presence loomed over her life like a dark cloud. He continued to make unexpected appearances, his attempts to ingratiate himself with her growing more unsettling by the day. As the wedding day approached, Nathaniel noticed Sarah's anxiety, but remained oblivious to the true cause. He was overwhelmed with wedding preparations and managing his father's constant interference. Sarah, realizing she couldn't rely on Nathaniel to shield her from Henry, decided to take matters into her own hands. On the evening of October 12th, just 2 weeks before the wedding, Sarah received a text message that made her blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, but she knew immediately who it was from. "Meet me at the lake house. We need to talk. Alone." The lake house was the Whitmore family's secluded property on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. Sarah's initial instinct was to ignore the message, but fear and anger compelled her to confront Henry once and for all. She texted Emily, her best friend, about where she was going and who she was meeting, just in case something went wrong. Then she drove to the lake house, her heart pounding with each passing mile. The lake house was dark and foreboding as she pulled up the gravel driveway. There were no lights on, and the surrounding woods seemed to close in around her. She hesitated at the front door, debating whether to turn back, but then she saw Henry's silhouette through the window. He was waiting for her. She took a deep breath and knocked. Henry opened the door almost immediately, his face lighting up with a smile that chilled her to the bone. "I'm glad you came, Sarah," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The house was eerily quiet as they entered the living room. A fire crackled in the fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Henry gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her eyes never leaving his. "What do you want, Henry?" she demanded. He regarded her with an unsettling calmness, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I want to protect my family, Sarah, including you." "I don't need your protection," she snapped. "I need you to leave me alone." Henry's expression hardened. "You don't understand, do you? Nathaniel is my only son. Everything I've built is for him. I won't let anyone, not even you, take that away." Sarah took a step back, her pulse racing. "I'm not taking anything away from him. I love him, and I want to be with him. But you're the one who's trying to destroy everything." Henry's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she saw the full extent of his obsession, a dangerous intensity that terrified her. "You've already made your choice, haven't you?" he said softly, almost to himself. "I tried to reason with you, but you won't listen." He took a step toward her, and Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She glanced around, looking for an escape, but Henry was blocking her way. Panic surged through her as she realized just how isolated they were. "Stay away from me," she whispered, backing away. But Henry's movements were swift. He grabbed her arm, his grip vice-like, pulling her close. "If I can't have you, Sarah, no one will." The words barely registered before she saw the glint of a knife in his other hand. She screamed, struggling against his hold, but he was too strong. He shoved her against the wall, the cold blade pressing against her throat. Sarah's mind raced, terror gripping her as she struggled to break free. "Henry, please, don't do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. But he was beyond reason. "You should have listened," he hissed, his voice twisted with rage and desperation. "Now it's too late." In one swift motion, he slashed the knife across her throat. Sarah's eyes widened in shock, a strangled gasp escaping her lips as she staggered backward, clutching her neck. Blood poured from the wound, staining her dress as she fell to her knees. Henry watched, his expression blank, as Sarah collapsed on the floor, her life slipping away. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of her labored breaths, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped altogether. He stood there, staring at her lifeless body, the knife still clutched in his hand. His mind was numb, the reality of what he had done slowly sinking in. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had meant to scare her, to make her understand, but now, the gravity of his actions hit him like a tidal wave, and he stumbled backward, dropping the knife as he tried to comprehend the enormity of what he had done. The woman who had captivated him, who had refused to be controlled, was now dead at his feet. Henry's breaths came in ragged gasps as he looked around the room, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He had to cover this up. But how? He staggered to the door, glancing back at Sarah's body one last time before bolting into the night, his heart pounding with the weight of his guilt and fear. Henry Whitmore drove aimlessly through the darkened streets, his mind racing. Blood still stained his hands, and the memory of what he had done at the lake house replayed in his mind like a nightmare. He couldn't believe it. He had killed Sarah, the woman he was obsessed with, in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Panic and guilt clawed at him as he struggled to come up with a plan. His first instinct was to flee, to get as far away from Glenwood as possible. But he knew that would only raise suspicions. He had to think rationally, cover his tracks. He couldn't let anyone know that he had been at the lake house that night. Henry pulled his car over in a secluded spot near the woods and took deep, steadying breaths. He wiped the blood from his hands with a handkerchief, then tossed it into the underbrush. He needed to clean up, to get rid of any evidence that could link him to the crime. He headed back to the Whitmore estate, entering through the back entrance to avoid being seen. He scrubbed his hands in the kitchen sink, the water turning pink as he washed away the last traces of Sarah's blood. He changed his clothes, bagging the blood-stained ones and placing them in the fireplace. As the flames consumed the evidence, Henry tried to calm his racing thoughts. He had to make it look like Sarah never arrived at the lake house. He checked his phone, deleting the incriminating text message he had sent to her. He hoped she hadn't told anyone about their meeting. Then he remembered Nathaniel. If Sarah had told him where she was going, he would know who was responsible. Henry's heart pounded as he considered his next move. He had to get ahead of this. He needed to control the narrative, to steer suspicion away from himself. He picked up the phone and called Nathaniel, forcing a calmness into his voice. "Nathaniel, it's your father. I just wanted to check on you and Sarah. Everything okay?" Nathaniel's voice on the other end was tense. "Sarah isn't answering her phone. She told Emily she was going to meet someone, but she didn't say who. I'm worried." Henry's stomach twisted. He had to act quickly. "I'm sure she's fine, son. Maybe she just needed some time alone. You know how stressful wedding preparations can be. Let me know if you hear from her, okay?" He hung up, his hands trembling. Nathaniel didn't know yet, but it was only a matter of time before Sarah's body was found, and everything would unravel. He had to divert attention elsewhere. The next morning, the news of Sarah's disappearance spread like wildfire through Glenwood. Nathaniel, frantic with worry, contacted the police. Search parties were organized, scouring the woods and the lake area. But it was Henry who made the discovery. Feigning shock and grief, he led the search team to the lake house. "I had a feeling she might be here," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. This place always brought her peace. When they found Sarah's body in the living room, a knife wound to her throat, the scene was horrifying. Henry put on a masterful display of devastation, collapsing to his knees beside Nathaniel, who was sobbing uncontrollably. "Who could have done this?" he cried, clutching his son's shoulder. The police immediately launched an investigation. Nathaniel was questioned, but his alibi was solid. He had been with friends all evening, worried about Sarah's whereabouts. Henry, too, was questioned, but his performance was flawless. He described the text message from Nathaniel, how worried he was about Sarah, and how he had searched the lake house out of sheer desperation. For a while, it seemed like Henry would get away with it. But then, as the investigation deepened, a forensic team found traces of blood in the fireplace at the Whitmore estate, blood that matched Sarah's DNA. They also recovered the remains of the handkerchief Henry had discarded in the woods, its bloody fibers tying him to the murder. Confronted with the evidence, Henry's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He was arrested and charged with Sarah's murder, his obsession and possessiveness laid bare for all to see. The community was stunned. The man who had once been their most powerful figure was now a criminal, his life in ruins. Nathaniel, devastated and betrayed, left Glenwood, unable to bear the weight of his father's actions. As for Henry, he was sentenced to life in prison, his empire reduced to nothing but ashes. The obsession that had driven him to such lengths ended in the destruction of everything he had ever valued, and the memory of Sarah's lifeless eyes haunted him until the day he died behind bars.